Hello everybody, it's your boy. Now, following on from the last video, where we talked about J.K. Rowling and her new book, and the apparent transphobia of her cross-dressing antagonist, Rose of Dawn, friend of the channel, was invited on to Good Morning Britain to talk about the issue with Piers Morgan, his co-host, who I forgot the name of, and of course, some trans activists. Now, I don't particularly like GMB, partly because of Piers, and also because it seems like an American import, like Good Morning America. I think that's probably where we got that from. I don't think that kind of show translates well into British TV. Now, I'm going to react to this because, good lord, this is a good video to watch, and it's going to be completely unscripted because I want to give my reaction as genuine as possible. We're going in hard, lads, so let's just do this, shall we? Jesus Christ, that is a terrible intro.
A hashtag reading RIP J.K. Rowling, as we said earlier, has been trending on Twitter. Harry Potter author has not died, but is the latest victim of cancel culture.
It comes because of her new book. It is said to feature a male serial killer who dresses in women's clothing. It's divided opinion and, of course, caused a storm online. So, let's talk about this.
So why are we talking about trans people when the character themselves is not trans? Now, obviously, in the original video that I made, the reason why people do this is manifold. Some were convinced that it was trans because the person happens to be dressing as a woman, even though they're a man. That does not make you trans at all. As I've mentioned before, cross-dressers have existed for a very long time, and most of them are not trans. They don't have gender dysphoria. Not only that, in her essay, which really annoyed people, J.K. Rowling implied that the character, or at least some characters in the new book, were going to be trans because she was studying this issue, quote-unquote, in order to use it for the novel. As it turns out, either she doesn't know what a trans person actually is, or she duped all of you and was doing this purely to sell the book. You all know my opinion on that. I think she did it to sell the book. If she was truly a TERF, it would be a trans person.
With Rose of Dawn, who is a trans activist and YouTuber, who says J.K. Rowling has done nothing wrong. Broadcaster and politician George Galloway, who says cancel culture is intellectually suffocating. And journalist Benjamin Butterworth, who says this is people being heard in a way they weren't previously.
Oh, this guy's been on before, by the way, and I think the last one that he was on, which got 4.8 million views, and it was entitled, Should Piers Morgan be fired for his views on gender? Because Piers Morgan is quite conservative when it comes to gender. He believes there's only two, as well most people do in the world, except for people like Butterworth.
Benjamin Butterworth, I wonder if you could just explain first why J.K. Rowling is in this mess.
Well, J.K. Rowling has been tweeting derogatory comments about trans people for some months now. Some years she's been suggesting her anti-trans views. And she has reportedly, her new book under a male name indeed, features a character who dresses as a woman in order to kill. And a lot of people, myself included, are incredibly worried about how that smears trans people.
Of course, cancel culture isn't witch hunting, it's not trying to censor people, it's just giving voice to people by taking others' voices away. The character is not trans. Just because a male or a female dresses in the opposite sex's clothes doesn't make them trans. What she said wasn't strictly speaking transphobic. In fact, she only mentioned that we can't erase women's experiences because if you deconstruct the idea of woman, what are we left with? Nothing. Although she does believe, at least she purports to believe, that trans women are not women. They are men, biologically, which is true. They do not suddenly magically become biologically female because they get put on hormone treatments.
Hang on. You said a man who dresses as a woman in order to kill.
Yeah.
Not a transgender person.
According to the reviews, this person is a transvestite.
Which is not the same, and you know it's not the same, but I guess you need to blur the lines where the lines don't need to be blurred.
The truth is that for a lot of people...
But a transvestite is not necessarily a transgender person, but you're saying this is an example of hate against transgender people, even though it's not a transgender person.
I am indeed, because in a lot of people's minds who are not familiar with the distinctions of trans people with these issues and may have seen J.K. Rowling's other derogatory comments against trans people, this will be seen as a way to debase them. This will be seen as an insult to all trans people, the idea that we should be afraid or nervous.
Except that everybody knows what a transsexual is. Everybody knows what a transvestite is. Everybody knows that. We've been to the pantomime. We know the difference. You have to be monumentally ignorant to not work out what transgender and transvestite mean. I'm sorry, but you're clutching at straws and you're trying desperately to link this character to transphobia and thus attacking trans people, and you're failing miserably. You've been called out already, and you can't even articulate, you can't even prove why it's transphobic.
With respect, you haven't read the book, have you?
No, nobody's read the book besides a handful of...
And do you support the RIP J.K. Rowling hashtag?
I mean, I think if there's any sense of the people among those hashtags that were saying, death threats or that she should be something like dead, that is clearly unbelievably unacceptable.
What would you like to happen to her then?
Now that's the thing, nobody's read the book. Nobody except for critics and a few handpicked people like Nick Cohen, who's not a critic. He's a commentator, but he somehow got an advanced copy and says that the book is very feminist and also not transphobic at all, and the ending kind of makes everything make sense. This reminds me of Life of Brian. Back in the day, when that was released, that caused an uproar in the Christian community because of its depiction of Brian, who they assumed was Jesus Christ, who wasn't Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is in the film and is portrayed completely straight and in the most positive light possible. Brian is a satirical device to criticise their ideology, but most of them had never watched it, and when they had this debate on live TV, it was John Cleese and Michael Palin against Malcolm Muggeridge and this other guy who was like a bishop or some kind of priest, and they hadn't seen the film. At least one of them had seen the film, and they were trying to criticise them based on stuff they'd heard through second-hand sources. And this is exactly what's going on now with J.K. Rowling, although she hasn't, as far as I'm aware, made a piece of art as good, if not better, than Life of Brian, and I don't think she ever will make anything as good as the Pythons could make it. But these people will strike at anybody as long as it helps them gain more power.
Well, what I would like is for people to not buy this book, for people to challenge J.K. Rowling on her views that are nasty and derogatory to trans people.
You're telling people not to buy a book that you haven't read. Nick Cohen, who is a top liberal left writer, has written a piece for The Spectator. J.K. Rowling's latest novel, which he's read, is not remotely transphobic. If you actually read it, it doesn't have any transphobia in it. So again, I ask you, you want to have a book cancelled that you have actually not read?
Piers, you also have not read the book.
I've read Nick Cohen's full review, which goes into great detail, which means that actually all the premise for why she has to be RIP'd is actually based on a complete load of nonsense.
Well, they're doing it on purpose, Piers. They know it's not trans. They know it's a transvestite, or at least somebody who has a fetish for women's clothing, I think it actually is. He's not actually a transvestite, and he wants dresses as a woman to get to a victim. Nobody other than the select few critics have read the book. Some people have read reviews, and to be fair, even reading Nick Cohen's review doesn't help you either, Piers, because that's Nick Cohen's opinion on it, and that reinforces your opinion on that because you share similar views to J.K. Rowling. Really, all of us are debating about a book that we've not read. Now, thankfully, I don't care whether or not the book is or is not transphobic, because to me, that was never the point. To me, it was all about J.K. Rowling doing what she usually does and playing to particular crowds. And this is exactly what she was doing, only this time she was drumming up a bit of controversy because of the book and the particular antagonist within it.
And yet, let's be clear about this. What it is about whipping up hatred and concern and fear.
No,
which is
you're the one whipping up the hatred. And all those who have been contributing to the RIP J.K. Rowling, they're the ones that want her dead, cancelled, shamed, vilified, finished for writing a novel that none of you have read, which, according to Nick Cohen, in his lengthy review, is not remotely transphobic.
Just before we get into that bit, can I just say that the guy has yet to actually give us quotes. He can read the quotes off in the interview, even though it's only 12 minutes, of J.K. Rowling actually being transphobic, because, truth be told, she hasn't actually said anything remotely considered bigoted. It's all out there. Why is it that we have to go and look for it ourselves? It doesn't take long to read out 240 characters, Mr. Butterworth. It really doesn't. I say it's transphobic, therefore it is. My mob says it's transphobic, therefore it is. And there's nothing you can do about it. Yes, I can't actually prove it. Yes, there's no actual tangible link between this antagonist that isn't trans with transvestites and all this other crap, but trust me, it's transphobic, and she must be cancelled because we've decided we don't like her because she said some things we don't like. They're too stupid to work out she said these things on purpose in order to drum up some publicity for the book, but hey, you know, whatever.
By the
So
way,
again, I ask
doesn't
you-
have a transgender
again, I
character
ask
in
you,
it.
how can you want to cancel something and shame somebody and bury them and have them RIP'd on Twitter for something you haven't even read?
Look, first of all, Piers, J.K. Rowling has not been cancelled.
Actually, she hasn't been cancelled. She's not been censored. Ugh, I'll have you know we've done nothing of the sort. No, but you're trying, aren't you? You're trying. There has been events that have happened since then. She's now no longer involved in the Harry Potter game that's coming out. And obviously, this latest attempt is to try and get her off Twitter.
The myth of cancel culture is not alive and well. That's the only thing that's dead today. If she'd been cancelled,
You just said
she
you
wouldn't
wanted
be a
people not to
billionaire
buy the
being
book.
discussed on
You just
breakfast
said,
television.
Benjamin, you wanted people not to buy her book. Why?
That's
Given
right.
it's not remotely transphobic.
Because she has a character in there which is said to be a person who dresses
Said so. You
as a
haven't
woman.
read it, have you?
And neither have you, so you can't be sure of that.
I've read
And
a
the
very
truth
lengthy
is-
review here which completely repudiates the whole point of your position. Let me bring in George Galloway. George, this is...
Before we get into George's little bit, can I just say that it's already done and dusted? He's already been debunked. He's been completely destroyed by Piers and his co-host. Forgive me, I don't know your name. What more could George Galloway, and I hate to say it, Rose, what more can you bring? The interview could have just been Piers versus Butterworth.
the problem here, isn't it? This cancel culture. This is a perfect illustration.
Now look, cancel culture is just a euphemism for witch hunts, for censorship. That's what it is. To be cancelled is to be censored, to be blacklisted. That's what it means.
Where people have tried to shame, destroy, cancel, ban, boycott. We had Jedward, of all people, calling for the book to be burned. They hadn't read it either. No one's actually read the damn thing.
The irony, of course, is that this will put it to the top of the bestseller list. The book they tried to ban always ends up there.
Absolutely spot on, Galloway. You are absolutely correct. This is what I've been saying as well. No matter what they do, it's the Streisand effect, and it always happens. When they try to block and ban and subdue something of this nature, it will always succeed. It will always become bigger. Every time there's a book that transgresses some kind of cultural law, it just becomes a massive success.
60 years ago, Alfred Hitchcock made a movie called Psycho. It's rather a significant movie. And the murderer in it, Norman Bates, didn't just dress up as a woman, he dressed up as his dead mother. No one at the time sought to cancel him for that because murderers come in all shapes and sizes, including bra sizes.
That's brilliant. That's a great line. George is actually on fire in this. I don't particularly like the guy, and I think he's a really insufferable leftist when he's on Twitter. But when it comes to this particular question, he's spot on. This is completely right. I agree with him 100%. But the difference is, in 1960, Psycho had its own controversy, but it wasn't really to do with the murderer himself, as far as I'm aware. It's more to do with the violence that was shown on film, which wasn't a lot even by the standard of 1960, and also showing a toilet. There was like a weird unwritten rule that you couldn't show a toilet in a film. It got some criticism for that. It was other things, but not the murderer himself. Silence of the Lambs. That was an actual trans character, as far as I'm aware, who was the murderer that Jodie Foster was trying to hunt down and to save the people he was capturing and trying to kill.
You get people that dress up, you get people that are women, people that are men, who kill other people. It's fiction. And when you're in the territory of hating someone for a fictional character they have drawn in a book that you have not read, I'm afraid it's you that is deeply in psychiatric territory.
Okay.
Absolutely spot on. It's fiction at the end of the day. We're arguing about fiction. I don't care if she chooses to write a book where a trans person is portrayed negatively. I don't care about that because I have the mental fortitude to know that unless it really is a terrible caricature, most likely it's just an evil person. The fact that they're trans is secondary. At the end of the day, it's fiction, and as George Galloway says, murderers come in all shapes and sizes. But remember, we're dealing with a type of person, a new leftist, who thinks that things are such black and white that murderers can only be portrayed as one thing: male. Doesn't matter what the race, although they would prefer it to be white, but male.
Let's
the novelist.
let's talk to Rose of Dawn, because you are a trans activist. In the review that Piers references, Nick Cohen says transvesticism barely features. When it does, nothing is made of the fact that the killer wears a wig and a woman's coat, not a dress, as a disguise when approaching one of his victims. As a trans activist, do you find depictions of somebody as a transvestite wearing a woman's coat and wig offensive?
Of course not. People are in the right to be able to dress whatever way they want. We know that a transvestite isn't the same as a trans person. However, there is this kind of growing rhetoric from within the trans activist movement that there is this umbrella of various different gender identities, gender expressions, and that sometimes does include transvestites, which have absolutely nothing to do with actual trans people. That is people who deal with gender dysphoria and transition in order to deal with it. That's what a trans person is by definition. A transvestite has nothing to do with that. Just going back to the book itself, from what I understand, it's simply just one line. And it's not even necessarily referring to the killer as a transvestite. I think it just mentions that the killer at one point wore a wig and a woman's coat. So that there is no trans rhetoric coming out of this book at all. And I take issue with Ben saying that J.K. Rowling has been issuing a lot of derogatory rhetoric around trans people. I haven't seen her using any kind of slurs. I haven't seen her saying anything which is incredibly problematic to the point where she needs to be removed from public life. She's someone who probably the vast majority of the British public would agree with. Like, for example, the idea that there are only two biological sexes. I mean, that's something which we used to take advantage of.
Again, there's not much I can add because Rose is pretty much making the arguments for me.
Until current year, where it's being pushed onto us that this is more of a spectrum or a social construct, which is absolutely nonsense. If people really look at what J.K. Rowling is saying, they would see that all of this outrage is simply a way for activists to kind of feel important. They want to have a target, and it just so happens to be, in this case, it is one of the richest women in the world. Now, she has been a victim of cancel culture. There have been people calling for her publisher to drop her. There have been calls on social media to effectively remove her from the platform. Even a poster in Edinburgh train station was removed, which just said, "I love J.K. Rowling," simply because someone was upset at the idea that people might admire her.
Yeah, and the point is, Benjamin Butterworth, I don't even like J.K. Rowling. I've had loads of run-ins with her. She was leading the cancel culture. She was joyous when I got abused on national TV.
And that is, again, a very pertinent point by Piers. She used to involve herself in this thing. She helped create the monster that is now euphemistically called cancel culture. She is part of that. To some extent, she's reaping what she sowed. I've always said that to some extent, she doesn't deserve it in terms of being censored. She doesn't. Morally, in terms of reaping what you sow, she deserves all the punishment she's getting because this is what the left wanted. And this is what they're going to get. There comes a point where there aren't as many right-wingers and bigots that you can cancel because they'll all have been cancelled. You can only purity spiral. The left can't wait for the rest to all be cancelled. They have to do it immediately. And that's exactly what's going on, and Piers is correct once again.
In America, I've got no reason to defend her, but I do defend her right to free speech. And I would ask you this. Given that you want her cancelled over a book you haven't read, which you clearly have misunderstood anyway, out of interest, if I was to write a novel tomorrow about, I interview real-life serial killers of all shapes and sizes and genders. If I was to write a novel tomorrow, is your position that I would not be allowed to make it a transgender killer? Because that doesn't seem very equal to me. If your battle is for equality, surely criminals in novels could be...
No, don't you understand? It has to be 100% positive portrayals.
Transgender. Or are you saying it's one rule for people like me, so it'd have to be a white, straight guy like me, but I couldn't actually have a transgender killer? What is your position?
The point is that when so few people know about trans people, when they're so unfamiliar and so rarely covered in books like this, the idea that the only...
But I thought recently, according to GLAAD, that this is an old, tired trope. This is something that's always been in fiction and media. But apparently, according to Mr. Butterworth...
The supposed representation, as most people will interpret it, of a trans person is that they are a killer who dresses as a woman in order to kill.
So just to clarify, what you're saying... OK, but to answer my question then, we could never have a transgender killer in a novel. Is that what you're saying?
Well, the idea that they dress as a woman in order to kill, as is reported, is the problem, not...
So dressing as a woman is the problem. You're basically saying that yes, we shouldn't have transgender villains or anything like that, or murderers, whatever, in fiction, but dressing as a woman in itself, as a man who's evil, isn't a bad thing to write in a book. It's just not.
The idea in itself...
No, I've just asked you a very straightforward question, which you're trying, for whatever reason, you're trying to avoid the answer. The question's very straightforward. Could I write a novel with a transgender killer? There are millions of transgender people in the world.
If you were to do that, I would fear it would be to whip up the same hatred.
Okay.
And
so I wouldn't be allowed to. But if I was to write a novel which had a person like me doing all the killing, you would find that absolutely fine.
But you are not as unfamiliar to people. There are lots of cis, rich, white men, that's men born as men.
Don't call me cis. I'm not actually a cis. I'm a white guy. You can just call me a white guy.
Again, Piers is right. I don't need to repeat what he's saying. That's really what it boils down to. But I will add that the reason why they don't want villains to be minorities is because of the progressive stack. Because they feel that even fictional characters, even portraying something negative, or just a character that is a certain demographic as negative, means that somehow that is similar to something that would have happened way back in the day, like minstrel shows or things like that. They think that is equivalent to actual caricatures that are racist and were designed to hurt and humiliate and to spread dehumanizing effects. Well, of course, it's not true. Most of the time, the demographics of a character is just window dressing. Real thing is about, well, their character, about what they do, what they think.
This is language that you use that I don't even understand.
White man.
George Galloway, let me bring in George Galloway. Here we have it, George, don't we? This is the bottom line with this culture, with this culture war, is that as long as I write a series, as long as I write a... No, Ben, you've had your say. George, if I was to write a novel and the killer...
Oh, Rose is just laughing her head off because it's just typical, isn't it? And he's getting absolutely destroyed and the guy's completely oblivious to the fact that he's just been destroyed. Just keep on trucking, saying the same thing over and over again, NPC style.
Looks like me or you, right, is a straight white guy, that's fine. But if I was to actually make the killer a transgender killer, and there are millions of transgender people in the world, that is unacceptable and I would have to be shamed, vilified and cancelled.
Well, can't people see the danger of policing fiction, telling novelists what mould they must put their characters in, what arc of narrative they must have because they might offend an activist like Benjamin Button? It's unbelievably ridiculous and dangerous.
Benjamin Button. Oh, George.
He's Benjamin Butterworth. I don't think he's getting younger as he gets older, clearly.
Well,
you may have a point. It is utterly dangerous. That's my point, Susanna.
Yes. No,
Listen, I totally agree. I've got a whole book coming out.
Again, I can't disagree with it. What else can I add to that?
About all this. And I hope, Benjamin, you read it. You're in it. So I hope you read it.
Oh, yes, you're in Piers's book.
Because you might learn that the best way to preach about tolerance is to show a vague semblance of tolerance yourself. Because that's the problem. The problem with the woke brigade is you're never remotely tolerant. What you want to do is have RIP J.K. Rowling trending. Because you don't like a book you haven't read. I mean, it's preposterous. Anyway, we've got to leave it there. Guys, thank you all very much indeed. We really appreciate the debate.
And that is the end of GMB segment with Rose of Dawn. I think she did really well, considering they didn't really bring her in. Obviously, being new to the whole commentary circuit in the mainstream at the very least, she wasn't going to get as much as George Galloway or Benjamin Butterworth/Button. I love that bit from George. I hope he did it on purpose, but he had an old man moment, but it was still funny. At the end of the day, I can't really add more to it because there was 3/4 of the people I agreed with. And I'm actually surprised. I mean, this is probably due to our hosts and maybe some of the producers. I'm actually surprised that for once, the SJWs, the woke left, are actually outnumbered by saner voices. Even the other leftist on the panel, Galloway, was in complete disagreement with Benjamin Butterworth, and not only that, was making very good, cogent arguments for free speech and why we should not be policing fiction. Because once you start policing how people can express themselves within art, especially since in art you can criticise culture, you can criticise society, and, in the words of the left, speak truth to power. If you can't do that in fiction, how else are you going to do it in real life? Because they will soon quickly turn towards people like Rose of Dawn, people like George Galloway. And not only that, a pressure valve will be shut down, so people cannot express their own ideas and opinions that might otherwise be considered wrong or against the mainstream. And moreover, where does it stop? There is no limit to censorship, unfortunately, and it is a slippery slope. It's not a fallacy, it has always been that way, and it always will be. Why there should be the least amount, preferably zero, as possible. Again, it is my opinion that all of this was made to sell the book, and as George Galloway said, this will be a bestseller because people will be seeing all this going on Twitter and in real life on GMB and things like that, and they will want to see how bad the book actually is, and then find it's a great big nothing burger. As I said, the book is completely and utterly harmless. There's nothing in it that is remotely transphobic or bigoted. But hey, you know what? This is 2020. This has been the case since at least 2013. So we better just have to roll with the punches and make sure when anything like this comes up, we make sure that the left can't take any more miles because we've given them enough mileage already. So anyway, I will leave it there, guys, and I'll see you all later.